Hello and welcome to this year's LAD talk on the state of the native Linux Lustre client. Um, this is the second talk I've given at LAD about this project, which is one of the longest projects. This is a status update where we're at and what we're going to do this next year. So, quick overrun of the history. This is one of the oldest outstanding projects. Started 7 years ago when EMC pushed it to the staging tree. At that time, Lustre supported many platforms like Solaris, wasn't supported by the core Lustre developers. EMC tried to maintain it alone for 1 year. They dropped it during that time. Oleg was involved with it, and he kept maintaining it for 2 more years. And then it went into a state of disrepair and neglect. Uh, then I started to become involved in it, seeing it as a long-term potential for the health of the community, especially at that time when Lustre was going from Sun to Wham Cloud to Intel. It was changing hands. So there was a lot of questions about its stability at that time and 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 its health. Today we have a much bigger, more community outside of the core Lustre team that's now working on Lustre, so it's much better shape. During that time, we were moving forward in the staging tree. We went from 2.5 to 2.8. Um, we were fixing a lot, though there were a lot of barriers to the staging tree, which ended up us dropping out. So not too long before we left the staging tree, Neil Brown from SUSE started to become involved. Though it was too late at that time for the staging tree, but the staging tree wasn't a good fit for our project. So it ended up now being moved to a private repo. Neil did the initial repo. He does a lot of prototyping work now, and I have a private repo which follows the OpenSFS branch very closely. And so last year we went from 2.11 support to what was the latest Lustre master at that time, and this so at LAD at this time, I just got it in sync with the OpenSFS branch, and now we're still this year. So that's where we're going to progress over what's happened this last year. So in this year, we've kept in sync. We're usually only about 2 weeks behind. All the work to keep it, it's a much lower barrier to keep it in sync, so that there's always a flow to the Linux client to keep it in sync. But at the same time, there was a lot of work done on the native Linux client, a lot of bug fixes, a lot of improvements. Those have been flowing in. The majority of those have been landed to the OpenSFS branch. So now it's a lot less items to be done. There's still some outstanding work, but it's a much smaller pool than it used to be. Some of the benefits of that work has been support for newer kernels, which leads to rapid support for newer distros like Ubuntu 20, which is now supported, will be supported for 2.15 for clients. Server support is being worked on. We have support for the latest MoFed stacks. We're always worked that always shows up in the latest kernels first. We've had performance gains from some of the rhash table work and from some of the lock. We had a global LU object lock that was broken up, so there's lots of improvements that have been backported, which have been beneficial to the community, and also bug fixes. So as at this time, OpenFS branch actually supports up to 5.11 for its clients. Its server needs a little bit more work for LDiskFS, and then there's some ZFS issues. The native client is at 5.8, and this is due to the FS crypt, which has been backported on OpenSFS. And there have been some changes done, but we're waiting until the FS crypt stuff to land to 2.15, and then once the majority of that work is landed, we can move forward the Linux version that Lustre supports in the native client pretty rapidly. I have patches ready to move it forward pretty quickly. And of course, the reason we can progress so well is this has been a big community effort. So the main drivers has been myself as well as Neil Brown from SUSE. He's done an excellent job, and of course I want to thank all the people out there who have had given feedback and reviews of patches that have been pushed to the OpenSFS branch, such as Arsharad and Erlung from Amazon, and Sean from HPE Cray. I would like to thank everyone who's been involved with this project. So now that we've kept it in sync, the question is, how healthy has it been over this last year? So all the testing is the same as any other community projects, such as ARM or Ubuntu. So officially, the OpenFSS branch is focused. WAMCloud officially supports Red Hat on x86 platforms. It takes a lot of effort to support any other platforms. So they don't have the resources for that. So those are always community efforts. And this is also a community effort. So it's in the same boat. Usually light testing is done. In the case of the native Linux client, due to the Lustre utilities needing to be patched to work against it, all the tests are being run manually. So right now I run all the tests locally in our test bed at ORNL. So I run it from the master branch, all the tests. I constantly update the test suite. And as I backport it, I make sure everything works. There is work being done to make the Lustre utilities build against the native Linux client. There are 2 outstanding patches which are in master next, and by the time that you hear this presentation should be landed to Lustre 2.15. So that means Lustre 2.15 will be the first Lustre version that you can build against the Linux client. You don't have to build any of the Lustre modules. So you just download the Git repository, you do a configure -- disable modules -- disable server, and build it and install your RPMs with your native client, and it'll work out of the box. So that's the goal, and we should be having that. So by the time of this presentation, we will be starting to begin discussions about how to set up automated testing. That will be discussed on the Lustre Devel mailing list. This will be probably of interest to people to the ARM community or Ubuntu or SUSE. How is this done? How do you set up a testing? Oleg has a system like this where he tests a fully debug-enabled kernel with everything, and he does it with his Lustre janitor. So we're going to set up something similar and feed it so you can see the results of patches pushed, and catch any regressions, and then make sure that patches are properly ported at that time. So, and we'll be able to do full testing then. It's much easier to do that once that is set up. So that's the next step that's going to be happening over the next year. Currently, the main tests are, of course, Sanity LNet and Sanity Test, which is the same for ARM and Ubuntu. If you look at the test results, the bugs are mostly the same. Every once in a while, we do have a regression because patches don't apply cleanly and things might be dropped. It does happen. It's pretty rare, 1 in 100 patches I found on the average. But usually it works, so bugs, it's pretty much the same thing. The largest source of failure on the native client is the OpenByFid cache that's used. Lustre has something called a .lustre directory that contains the FID for a quick lookup. It's kind of like an overlay FS. It does things that violate the D cache, the D-entry cache in the Linux kernel, which is reported as bugs in newer kernels. And there's always the potential that that's going to be broken for directory entries because you can't have multiple hard links to directories. That's being worked on. There's a prototype patch, which I listed, to resolve this issue. Out of that work, that work will fix file sets as well, which has been broken a long time on OpenSFS, as well as allow OpenByFid for normal users. So that's the work that's coming out. And of course, besides those tests, I do test other tests like Sanity PCC and Sanity FLR. All those tests are being done, and I fix bugs when I do the expanded testing. The other thing that's being handled on the OpenSFS tree, this is more of that issue in that tree than the native Linux client. The native Linux client has proper UAPI headers, and so there are rules about UAPI headers which are broken in the OpenSFS tree. Most of those have been resolved with the LU13903 work. There are some new ones coming along which I plan to address. The general rule is whatever you put in there has to be used by kernel space and user space. Lustre tends to break that rule, which is considered a no-no, and things can get removed from the header, so we need to avoid future breakage once we're in the proper Linux tree. Uh, the other issue is that userland APIs constantly change and break userland utilities. A good example of this is LNet Cuddle. It's a tool used to configure your LNet. Well, about every 5 or 6 patches that land to LNet, and this is during a release cycle for break LNet Cuddle, that it'll crash your kernel if you try to use it with a few patches earlier. That constantly changes. The solution I'm proposing is coming out of the IP version 6 work is to use netlink. So there's going to be a netlink to YAML interface. This allows the userland utilities to work no matter how many changes you do. You can do all the changes you want, and the utilities don't have to be rebuilt for that. You'll see that used for many applications in the near future. So that's the status of how healthy the client is. So the good news is we're almost done with this work. So what's left? So that's the URL link. You can see all the things that are left. There are a few things that are pretty big changes left, but most of them are actually small. I'm going to talk about the big changes. There's also an LU ticket, LU 12511, that tracks all this work. And of course, the biggest barrier to pushing the Linus's trees is the IP version 6 support, which is being worked on right now for 2.15. A lot of internal changes. The userland changes will probably end up in 2.16, so it will be fully turned on. Some of the nice benefits of this work will be the support of not just IP version 6, but any protocol. So like one of the things we could support is we don't need IP addresses on your InfiniBand cards anymore. So you can use hardware addresses. So these are some nice functionality that's going to come out. So once that work is complete, we're going to push it to Linus. And of course, the other issue is IB support. So when we were in staging, the K02 IB LND driver did a lot of low-level stuff. So that caused a management nightmare for the InfiniBand maintainers. So they want us to use generic APIs, which they have developed for a lot of their drivers, so they don't have to do a lot of maintenance with our file system. So we'll see how that goes, and because we do want to have InfiniBand support, it would be nice to have it with Lustre when it lands, so that way we can have as many users as possible. The other thing is, of course, we're going to continue squashing as many bugs as testing expands, especially as soon as we have an automated test system. Bugs, I expect for several months, we're going to be flooded with bugs that we're going to have to stomp out. And we can resolve those and get everything working. So what are the big ticket items left? Proc usage, we still have some of that left. So the Linux has required everyone to move out of proc, move to sysfs and debugfs. Sysfs is for simple files, files with simple one item. Debugfs, its limitation, it's root only. So in most cases, so I'm implementing a netlink API so that you can collect data instead of using debugfs. This works actually very well. It scales and performs better than using debugfs because currently you have to open lots of files and collect that data. But with netlink, you can pipe it, multiplex it right to a single socket and collect all that data. So a lot of less overhead, performs way better. We have to be careful with sysfs. One of the things is porting these things, mangle the names. We've had issues with that in the past, not only for porting from proc to sysfs, but other projects, creating new sysfs files. The naming conventions were wrong. We have a ticket open to enforce that and fix that. There's also ASLR compliant issues with that. So sysfs exposes some kernel address space to userland, and that's a big no-no. So there's work to move that to UIDs. And then, of course, LNet self-test, which it's in very poor shape. It's being reworked currently to work with netlink, which was needed for the IP version 6 support. It doesn't even work well with a lot of newer kernels. Smoke test is disabled for like on RHEL 8 because of its poor shape. So there's a lot of bugs in it that need to be fixed. It can crash easy if you do the wrong thing. And of course, it's the open by FID cache. that needs to be resolved. There's an outstanding patch for that that's going to resolve a lot of the file set issues and open by FID by user. So those are some of the those are the big ticket items. A lot of those are server side. So the good news is that a lot of this has been resolved for the client, which is our main aim to move upstream. So as that work will be ongoing with the server. So what does the future hold? Once it's merged to Linus's tree, it will start to show up in newer distros. So Kasuza is a supporter of this project. They will provide good support. Ubuntu is unknown. It is the closest to upstream. I'm sure it is a highly used system. So I expect that gap will be closed pretty quickly once it starts showing up. WAM Cloud will remain focused on Red Hat systems, of course. We're going to discuss triaging and testing outside of WAM Cloud. That will be discussed in the mailing list. It'll be of interest to other parties like ARM to see how this is done and how we can contribute to results for patches land. And of course, the goal will be new developers, which will be entering the community. We have new eyes looking on our code. We'll have bugs fixed. It'll be a benefit, a bonus, especially since WAM Cloud development team is a very small team. There are new teams developing at external sources like ORNL and Cray, but more developers, the better to distribute the load. The ultimate goal is to move everything to the Linux kernel. So LDiskFS, that's a barrier. There's a patchwork link there. It shows you parallel directory lookup on the VFS layer, which is a benefit to everyone. That was worked on. We're going to continue to we're going to push that forward once we start to look to push the server stuff. All the changes that will be done upstream will be backported to the OpenFS tree. So the OpenFS tree is not going to go away. It'll be like a MoFed tree. And of course, with the move to the Linux kernel, it'll be much easier to support newer stuff. And so it'll be and once the client is in, the server will be a much smaller leap forward to move that upstream. So this is where I asked for community involvement. So we're preparing to merge in the 2.16 timeframe. That's very realistic, the way we're moving ahead with the IP version 6 testing. Of course, we'll need greater scope of Lustre testing. We often see unique bugs that only the native client sees, and because we use newer kernels, and there's also there's a lot of differences between the native client. So you can grab it from my repo. I followed closely the OpenSFS branch. There it is at GitHub. There's a wiki for testing, and you can always report bugs if you do testing to the to Jira WAM Cloud. Please label it as the upstream label so we can know that it's specifically for that and not look at the OpenFSS branch. If you have questions, ask the Lustre developing mailing list. And of course, if your company wants to be involved in this work or any work it wants to, of interest to it, look at the Lustre working group. And of course, we present this always at Lustre conferences like LAD or LUG in the US to attract people, to make people aware of where we're at. I expect that once we're upstream, community involvement will actually grow exponentially. So what's the conclusions? The client mostly works from my testing. We're going to find out very shortly how well it really works. It's been kept up to date. We're getting ready to merge it to Linus's tree. And very realistically, I could see it in 6 months with the IP version 6 work. It depends on how fast that progresses. Of course, to make this right and have it in good shape for when it starts to show up, we'll need community involvement. Ways to do that is to join OpenSFS or join our LWG calls. Don't be afraid to ask questions and report problems. That's either on the WAM Cloud Jira or the Lustre developing mailing list. Or you can email me directly at my email address at infradead.org. Note, I don't read that email address all the time, so I might not respond right away. So it's better to use the Lustre Devel mailing list. And so lastly, I'd like to thank the U.S. Department of Energy, who's been very patient with me on this work since it's a side long-term project. And it's being funded under this contract. very much. And thank you for listening to this talk today, and taking time out. Thank you. Bye.